Agatha Christie was not the kind of woman who chased attention, and yet one day her name was everywhere, front pages, headlines, not just in England but around the world. A 36-year-old best-selling writer, a wife, a mother, walked out of her house and disappeared. And what really happened is still not fully explained. On December 3rd, 1926, a Friday evening at around 9:30, Agatha Christie went upstairs in her house. She kissed her daughter goodnight, came back down, took a small suitcase, put on a fur coat, got into her car and drove away. That was the last time anyone saw her. For the next 11 days she was vanished completely. No one knew where she was, no one knew what had happened to her. A perfect script for her own book, right? At that moment, Agatha Christie was already a very successful woman. She was not an obscure, aspiring writer. She had published 6 novels and her popularity was growing fast. Her latest book, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, had been a major success. She was earning serious money, bought a nice car, a rare thing in those times. And just a year earlier, she and her husband had finally bought a home of their own, where they were living with their 7-year-old daughter. From the outside, her life looked solid, respectable, and enviably secure. It seemed, at least on the surface, as though everything was going well and would only continue to improve. That is why what happened next shocked people so deeply. When Agatha didn't return, concern quickly turned into panic. A few days later, they found her car. It had clearly left the road and was positioned in a way that made it look very much like a nighttime accident. Inside it were her belongings, like a fur coat and a driving license. But Agatha herself was gone. The place where the car was found was not some neat roadside location near houses and shops. It was rough ground, broken terrain with pits, water, slopes, and dangerous edges. There were many ways a person could have been injured there, intentionally or accidentally. So naturally, a major search began. Police officers, volunteers, dogs, and local people began combing fields, woods, rivers, and lakes. Enormous resources were thrown into the search. By then, Agatha Christie was already famous enough that her disappearance became a national obsession. Thousands of people became involved. She was even searched for from the air in what is often described as one of the first recorded cases in which aircraft were used in a missing person investigation. As the search intensified, theories multiplied. Some believed she had been attacked. Others thought she had suffered an accident and might be lying injured somewhere, unable to call for help. Still, others suspected the worst. So Arthur Conan Doyle took a glove belonging to Christie to a medium who proclaimed, "The person who owns it is half dazed and half purposeful. She is not dead, as many think. She is alive." Doyle, creator of Holmes and his deductive method, was one of the leaders of the British spiritualism. An interesting paradox. I covered it in a dedicated video. Back to Agatha. I've read both of her autobiographical books, an autobiography and Come Tell Me How You Live. They are detailed, personal, and at times surprisingly open. She writes about her childhood, her travels, her emotions, her impressions, her marriage, and her life in general. But when it comes to those 11 days, there is almost nothing. No real explanation, no serious reflection, not even a proper attempt to account for it. It is as if the most dramatic episode of her life simply didn't exist. And that, to me, is where this story becomes especially interesting. The public imagination was completely captured by the case. This was not just a missing woman. It was a famous crime writer vanishing under mysterious circumstances, and that gave the story a special electricity. It felt like something people ought to be able to solve, and yet no one could. Then her husband, Archie Christie, came under closer scrutiny. He said he had been away for the weekend with friends and had no idea where his wife might have gone. But as police began asking more serious questions, less flattering details emerged. He had not simply been staying innocently with friends. He had spent the weekend with another woman. And even more damagingly, it turned out that just before Agatha disappeared, he had told her that he wanted a divorce. He intended to marry his mistress, Nancy Neal. That detail changed the emotional shape of the story immediately. At that point, suspicion naturally turned toward him. Suddenly, this was not only a mystery, it was also a domestic catastrophe. Another book-worthy detail: on the day she vanished, Agatha had written several letters. One went to her secretary and was practical, almost routine in tone. She said she was going to take some days off and go to spa. Another suggested she doesn't feel well and might be going away for a few days. And the third one was left for Archie. He refused to provide it, saying it was private. That refusal naturally deepened suspicion and gave the entire affair an even darker atmosphere. To further boost awareness of Christie's disappearance, the police announced an award of £100 for any valuable info about her whereabouts. Back in the day, that was a huge sum, comparable to advance payments for Agatha's books. No wonder they received tons of letters of wannabe witnesses, sometimes stating the absolutely improbable details. For 11 days, nothing made sense. Then, unexpectedly, she was found. One of the letters turned out to be straight to the point. 2 musicians from Countryside Hotel Orchestra reportedly saw her dancing at the hotel soiree. Not injured, not dead, not wandering in confusion somewhere nearby. She somehow traveled 230 miles from Surrey to Yorkshire's spa town of Harrogate. She was alive and staying in a hotel under a false name, and not just any false name. She used the surname of her husband's mistress, Mrs. Neal. She had apparently been there for days, eating, talking, and participating in ordinary life. She had even been reading newspapers, including the ones carrying stories about her own disappearance. That discovery outraged many people. Perhaps most of them secretly waited for another, more dramatic ending, like in Christie's books. Instead, the lady appeared to be just enjoying herself in a countryside spa, while everyone was nervously speculating and trying to save her of some dangerous trap. Even the police officials were pissed. They threw unprecedented resources on the search operation, while in the end everything looked like the author just staged the whole spectacle for hype, as we'd say today, to boost her own popularity. No wonder the story was even featured on the front page of the New York Times. The official explanation offered afterward added fuel to this gossip fire. Christie and her family wanted to ignore the press and media whatsoever, yet then decided to give a short comment stating that Agatha had suffered some kind of breakdown and temporary amnesia. It was said that she didn't know who she was, that she didn't recognize her husband when he arrived, and that she was seriously ill. Officially, that was more or less where the matter was allowed to rest. The reason this explanation remains unsatisfying is that this behavior itself doesn't quite fit the neatness of the story. This was not a person simply collapsing in confusion and drifting randomly. She left intentionally. She traveled. She checked into a hotel. She adopted a name. There is, at the very least, a strange degree of order inside a supposed disorder. And that is the part that keeps the case alive in people's minds. Half a century later, when Christie passed away and the world read her posthumously published autobiography, one could realize that it couldn't be a case of an age-old marketing trick to gain some popularity, or a deliberate and desperate attempt to bring the unfaithful husband back to the family. Agatha was, no doubt, an extremely brilliant and witty woman. She might have invented such arcs for her storylines, yet the life of her own just couldn't bear such a stain. She was a child of highly prudent Victorian society, bred as a proper lady who in her worst nightmare wouldn't dare to cast such a shadow on her own reputation. Since indeed, back in the day, such episode would only do harm, and did a lot of damage to her image in the eyes of the contemporary readers. Although, at the same time, truth be told, it increased book sales as well. Yet it becomes pretty obvious that future Dame Christie would never ever choose such a pathway deliberately. If you look at the broader context of her life at the time, though, the situation becomes much more understandable psychologically, even if it remains mysterious in detail. The next year of my life is one I hate recalling. As so often in life, when one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong. Indeed, the year 1926 had been one of the worst of her life. Her mother had died after a long illness, and Agatha was deeply attached to her. She was devastated by the loss. She was also left to deal with the practical and emotional aftermath. At the same time, she felt isolated. Her husband, by her own account, was not someone who dealt well with sadness or grief. He was not able to support her in the way she needed. Her close companion and secretary was absent. She was exhausted, lonely, and overwhelmed. I suppose I was already run down and slightly ill, but turning out that house with the memories, the hard work, the sleepless nights reduced me to such a nervous state that I hardly knew what I was doing. I worked like a demon. I began to get confused and muddled over things. I never felt hungry and ate less and less. Sometimes I would sit down, put my hands to my head, and try to remember what I was doing. A terrible sense of loneliness was coming over me. I don't think I realized that for the first time in my life, I was really ill. Christie recalls that she even forgot her own name once she needed to sign a check, and then couldn't remember how to start her own car. Later on in her life, she acknowledged that it was a beginning of a nervous breakdown. On top of that, she was under pressure as a writer. She had publishing obligations, deadlines, and expectations. She had recently entered a new stage in her professional life, and that brought its own strain. For a disciplined, responsible person with high standards, the sense that she might not be able to produce what was expected of her would have been another heavy blow. In other words, she was not simply a glamorous, famous writer living a charmed life. She was a woman under enormous emotional and psychological strain, trying to keep herself together while her marriage was collapsing and her inner life was clearly becoming unstable. That doesn't solve the case, of course, but it changes the way we see it. Maybe this was not, in essence, a disappearance. Maybe it was the visible collapse of a self that could no longer continue in the same form. Maybe it was an act of despair or dissociation or control or some mixture of all three. Some claim that it looks like a rare psychiatric disorder involving the loss of identity. Since back at the hotel she told fellow guests that she was a woman from South Africa who had recently lost a baby daughter. You see, back in the day, the mere notion of some mental instability, let alone depression, breakdown, or, God forbid, a hint to some mental illness, would produce shock waves among the public. Such problems were kept behind the closed doors. It was commonly believed that you'd better pull yourself together and stop nursing around with your shameful pettiness to yourself. In other words, mental health was not recognized as a legit thing and was perceived as some sort of heresy. And maybe that is precisely why Agatha said so little about this event afterward. Not in her books, not in her conversation with close friends, yet only once did she personally comment on it in a rather long interview to the Daily Mail 2 years after everything happened. There she basically repeated the same recollections of her terribly difficult personal circumstances at the time, private troubles into which I would rather not enter. That night I felt terribly miserable. I felt that I could go on no longer. I left home that night in a state of high nervous strain with the intention of doing something desperate. She confessed that she even entertained the idea of throwing herself into the river, yet realized she was too good of a swimmer to drown. Then, apparently, there was some sort of a car accident, an unfortunate one, as Christie claimed, where she hit her head, and that apparently led to her amnesia. Was it instead an unsuccessful attempt to take her own life, followed by an awkward escape out of shame for such a misbehavior for a faithful Christian? Remember, Agatha was a child of that strict Victorian code of conduct. She admitted it had been very wicked of her to try. Agatha wrote of the same fatal attempt of her alter ego, Celia, in her semi-autobiographical novel Unfinished Portrait, published in 1934 under the pseudonym. And Agatha's second husband confirmed that, in Celia we have more nearly than anywhere else a portrait of Agatha. Well, that later silence is to me the most revealing thing of all. She had opportunities later in her life to tell her story, explain it, reinterpret, soften the corners, dramatize it, or make peace with it in public. And she didn't. She didn't meaningfully include it in the account of her life, and she left a gap. That is not accidental, that is a decision. And once you notice that decision, it becomes difficult not to wonder what that silence meant to her and what it did to the rest of her life. That fictional Christie's alter ego says of her unfaithful husband, if he could be treacherous, then anyone could be treacherous. The word itself became unsure. I couldn't trust anyone or anything anymore. That's horribly frightening. Popular narrative keeps saying, Christie disappeared, how dare she, and left no explanation. Yet could or should there be any explanation at all? I couldn't trust anyone or anything anymore. That's horribly frightening. These words seem to firmly close the door and at the same time leave no question unanswered. Not everything that happens to a person belongs to the public, even if that person is famous. We like to believe that public lives can be fully explained, that every event has a clear meaning, a cause and a resolution, but real life doesn't work like that. What if that silence is not a puzzle for us to solve, but rather a boundary? And this way, maybe the real point is not to solve the mystery, but to recognize that some things were never meant to be explained.